Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. I met Mackenzie a few years ago through following her research, and I'm so excited that she's able to join us today to share her program on critical digital literacies. So thank you so much for being here, Mackenzie, and I'm going to pass things off to you, who will deliver a fabulous presentation.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you all so much. And it was so nice to see as everyone was coming in, so many familiar names. So thanks to everyone for coming today, no matter where you're coming from. So today is our exploration of critical literacies in the age of generative AI. My name is Mackenzie Salisbury, and I'm thrilled to be here working with the Frick. My background is in information literacy and the arts. I was the information literacy librarian at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago for almost 10 years. And I'm pretty passionate about how we engage with images, whether they're hanging in galleries or popping up on our phones. We are living in a pretty remarkable time. Images and information are everywhere on our phones and our social media feeds, and now increasingly generated by machines in ways that would have seemed like science fiction until just a few years ago. This information doesn't just decorate our world, they actively shape how we see reality, how we understand each other, and even how we see ourselves. This while what we talk about today is mainly seen as a critique of our current technologies, I'm actually a pretty large advocate for AI tools when thoughtfully and creatively used. In fact, I use several AI tools to create today's presentation. But before we dive in, I want to hear from you all. So if you could put your answer, I believe, in the chat, I should be able to see a couple. What's one platform where you see the most images in a day? Is it something like Instagram, TikTok, Google? And I'll give you all a couple, maybe like half a minute to respond. So I'm seeing a lot of Instagram and a lot of Google, certainly. Big Instagram crowd here, yes. TV, definitely. Zoom, that's a good one. I also feel like having worked mostly with students, a lot of students use Pinterest. So I'm interested if there's any Pinterest users out there. Um, great. So, well, as we're thinking about all of that, I think it's really important to kind of start with some general definitions. So essentially, I want you to keep those things in mind as we're going through. And my goal is really that you all will leave today's session with some tools for thinking more critically about what we're going to be talking about today. So let's start with the definitions. Most of us are familiar with the idea of digital literacy, so the ability to locate, evaluate, and use digital information effectively. Think of it as knowing how to search for reliable information or how to spot suspicious websites or how to navigate a new app without getting lost. But critical digital literacy takes us much deeper. It's not just asking, how does this work, but also asking, who built this and why? What assumptions does it carry? And who benefits from this system and who might be harmed? So, most of what we're going to talk about today is really framed in terms of questions, not necessarily in terms of answers. So we'll take some examples from what you all were saying in the chat. So on Instagram, you might ask, why does someone's post of breakfast get 10 likes and another person's post get thousands? The algorithm isn't neutral. It's making value judgments based on engagement patterns, timings, hashtags, and factors that we might not even be aware of. On Google, when you search for something like professional hairstyle, notice what comes up. Do you think the results are diverse? Do they reflect different cultural definitions of professionalism? The top results aren't necessarily the most accurate, they're the most optimized for Google's algorithm. And on TikTok, which I didn't see too many of in the chat, but the For You page is perhaps one of the most powerful curatorial forces in our time. It's deciding what millions of people see, shaping trends, and influencing everything from fashion to political opinions. But who is making these decisions and based on what criteria? And this is also something that museums are part of as well. So, something for our museum audience, the digital systems aren't unique in making editorial choices. Museums have always been curatorial spaces that encode decisions about what's valuable and what's worth preserving, as well as whose stories get told. So, just like an exhibition designer decides how to arrange artworks in a gallery, algorithms decide how to arrange content in our feeds. Both are powerful forms of curation that shape public perception. Okay, so a second question for you all, and I apologize as a instruction librarian, I always have questions. So, have you ever noticed in your social media feed showing you very similar types of content? And based on that, what do you think the algorithm thinks you're interested in? I'll give you all a couple minutes to respond. We have some people saying cottagecore things, adorable puppies, protests, printmaking, gardening, cooking, a lot of animals, which I appreciate in here. Things I just purchased, definitely that, certainly. So even just in asking this question, this is us practicing critical digital literacy. So what it's really about is developing habits of inquiry or questions that we can ask. So asking the questions and understanding that every image, every platform, every system is built by people with all their biases, assumptions, and blind spots. Okay, so how does generative AI work? And for those of you that feel like you know how it works, I apologize for my very short primer. But essentially, before we dive into specifics, I wanted to make sure we were all starting with kind of a baseline understanding of what's happening under the hood of some of these AI generators. So, generative AI, whether it's with images or text such as ChatGPT, works by analyzing massive data sets. We're talking millions of images, texts, or audio files to learn patterns and structures. Then it uses those patterns to create new content that mimics the originals. The crucial part is that these systems don't quote unquote understand in the human sense. They're not thinking about composition or meaning or cultural context. They're making statistical predictions about what pixel should come next based on everything they've seen before. And just yesterday, there was a report from Apple specifically about how AI can seem sentient, but when pushed, reveals that it's not exactly learning in the ways that sometimes it seems like it may be. So, this is kind of an analogy that I like to give. So, you can think of it like this. Imagine showing someone millions of photos of cats, and eventually they become incredibly good at drawing new cats that look realistic, even though each drawing is technically a quote unquote original. That's essentially what these systems do, but at an unimaginable scale and speed. So for platforms like ChatGPT, I like to give the example of when we go to write a text or an email, and your phone or computer suggests the next phrase. This is something called predictive texting, and it uses all your previous writing to try and guess statistically what word will come next. This is a very distilled and simplified version of what ChatGPT is, but essentially that is the process that it does. But instead of taking one person's writing, it's using the entire internet to learn from. And one fun fact, in the early days of ChatGPT, it hadn't quite learned yet from the entirety of the internet. So instead, it focused on digital spaces that had a lot of human created content, specifically dialogue. And one of the largest data sets it used early on was fan fiction websites. So, for instance, years ago, if you asked ChatGPT about vampires, the results were almost always linked to the Twilight series because there's a huge amount of fan fiction on the internet about Twilight. So tools like DALL-E, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion have made it possible to generate detailed, often visually stunning images in a matter of seconds. With just a few words, what we call the prompt, users can instruct these tools to produce images in nearly any style imaginable, from photorealism to impressionism to manga. For example, a prompt like futuristic city at sunset in the style of Monet can yield an image that convincingly mimics that painterly aesthetic. What makes these tools so compelling and potentially troubling is how easily they allow anyone to create content that appears uh, to be expertly crafted. They don't require technical skills in painting, photography, or design. Instead, they rely on natural language input and vast training data composed of millions of previously created images. This levels the playing field in some ways, but it opens up questions around authorship, ownership, and authenticity. This is a pretty critical moment to reflect on what it means to be a creator. When anyone can generate a Van Gogh with a click, how do we distinguish between imitation and innovation? These tools not only challenge the traditional boundaries of artistic labor, but also shift the relationship between creator, tool, and audience. Another issue worth noting is that the black box nature of these tools. While they appear simple to use, their underlying mechanisms are deeply complex and proprietary. We often don't know exactly what data sets they were trained on, how they weigh certain aesthetic elements, or how biases in those data sets influence the outputs. This opacity raises serious questions for educators, curators, and anyone concerned with ethical image creation and interpretation. So while it may be fascinating and even fun to explore these tools, we also have a responsibility to ask, what are we replacing? What histories and hierarchies are embedded in these images and information? And how can we use these tools with critical awareness and intentionality? So let's put this to the test. I'm going to show you, I have two images here, and I want you all in the chat to guess which do you think is the original artwork and which do you think was generated by AI. And I will give everyone, we'll say like, I don't know, 30 seconds to take a guess. I also put the word original here in quotation marks because I think that's a different talk, but an important one to have eventually. Right is the original, left is the original, both. Right is AI. Interesting. Okay, so um, for those of you who are interested in knowing, the image that is on the right is the original, and on the left is the AI. One thing that has been in recent conversation about specifically images is that AI created images are becoming a little bit more yellow. And there's lots of reasons around that or speculation as to why that is. But if you're ever looking at something like this side by side, they're very close, but the one on the left you can tell is just a slightly little bit yellow. Um, so whether or not you guessed correctly, this exercise highlights some critical issues that we need to grapple with. So the first is training data. These AI systems learned to create art by analyzing millions of existing artworks, many used without the artist's original consent. Imagine if someone copied your entire portfolio to teach a machine to paint like you, and then sold those machine-made paintings without crediting or compensating you. Current example of this is that just this year, there have been several major class action lawsuits filed against AI companies by artists, claiming their copyright work was used without permission. Getty Images is suing Stability AI for allegedly using 12 million copyrighted images from their database. The second question is around authorship. So when AI creates an image in the style of Picasso, who is the real artist? The person who wrote the prompt, the engineers who built the system, or Picasso, whose work taught the machine what Picasso-like means. A good current example of this involves Jason and M. Allen's 2022 AI-generated work, which won him the Colorado State Fair's Digital Arts Contest. The US Copyright Office ultimately ruled that the image couldn't be copyrighted because the AI, not Allen, was the dominant creator, meaning Allen could only claim rights to the prompt he used, not the finished image. Allen appealed both the copyright refusal and the subsequent denial of his claims, arguing that his extensive prompt crafting and iterative design process rose to the level of human authorship. The next is originality, and maybe my favorite one to argue about. So, can something be truly original if it's essentially a very sophisticated remix of millions of existing works? What does creativity mean when machines can generate infinite variations? An AI-generated artwork from Boris Eldgesson, which won in 2023 the Sony World Photography Award. He declined the award, emphasizing that the piece was created entirely by AI and was really meant to provoke a conversation about the nature of creativity and originality. This incident exemplifies the current debate about whether something created by algorithms trained on vast data sets, essentially remixing human created images, can truly be considered original or a genuine expression of human creativity. The last one is the tropes and stereotypes, and this is one that we're going to be almost exclusively focusing on for the rest of this talk. Um, so this is where things get problematic. So AI systems learn not just artistic styles, but also cultural biases embedded in their training data. AI-powered photo editing app Gradient, which generated troubling outputs by altering people's ethnicity or producing stereotype results, often reinforcing harmful racial and ethnic tropes. The backlash emphasized how AI models absorb and reflect cultural biases presented in their training data, causing significant ethical concerns. All right, so if I were to prompt the system right now, an AI system, so that could be DALL-E or Midjourney, with the prompt, create an image of a successful business person, what do you think would come up? I will wait for a couple of responses in the chat. I think you all are keen to what's happening. Yes, white men in a suit. It's true. Maybe some of you have done this before. So when we're looking here, what are we noticing? So obviously the gender, the race, age, clothing. So the systems often default to narrow stereotypes because that's what's dominating the training in their data. Another example that I've used in the past is if you prompt something like a nurse, oftentimes you get women, or a scientist, you'll predominantly see men. And the AI isn't deliberately sexist here. It's just reflecting patterns in millions of images it learned from, which themselves reflect our society's biases. So this brings us to some of the larger questions. When machines can generate authentic looking art in seconds, how do we value human creativity and labor? If AI can paint like Monet, what makes an original Monet special? Who benefits when art creation becomes automated and who gets left behind? So one more philosophical question for you all. As we're thinking about all these images and the ways that art is created, how do you think AI-generated art should be labeled when displayed in a museum or gallery? Should there be different rules for human-created art? And some of this is just about, I think the ultimate question is, should we be identifying when something is created by AI? And how so? How might we do that? Or just kind of speculate on some ideas here. Interesting. Lots of people say acknowledge it. Some people are saying add it as a collaborator. Treat it like we do colleagues. Interesting. Or a genre. I also think that is interesting. Lots of interesting ideas here. This was my favorite question when I was putting together this talk to ask, because I think it is it's one that is a little bit broader, certainly. Um, Interesting. All right. Well, thank you for all of those questions in the chat or the responses in the chat. Um, okay, so now we're gonna zoom out a little bit. Algorithmic bias and the digital canon. So we're gonna look at the bigger picture, how these systems don't just reflect individual biases, but can actually reinforce and amplify systematic inequalities. And that's something that we call algorithmic bias. Earlier, I mentioned what happens when we Google something like professional hairstyles right now. And while that's alarming when we get the results, why does it matter, right? So when researchers have done this search in the past, the results are overwhelmingly, of course, when searching for professional hairstyles, the results are overwhelmingly straight, blonde hair on white people. Now, is this because curly hair or locks is inherently unprofessional? Of course not. It's because the algorithm is reflecting biases in the data it was trained on, biases that come from society where certain beauty standards have privileged some over and marginalized others. There's an even more serious example. In 2018, MIT researcher Joy Buolamwini, who we'll talk about more in a little bit, discovered that commercial facial recognition systems had error rates of up to 35% for Black women, compared to less than 1% for white men. So this is the facial recognition technology that allows you to open your phone with your face. So she was working on this software for IBM, but when she used her own face as a Black woman, the system couldn't pick up her facial markers. When she put a white mask on top of her face, the system was able to fill in more information and recognize a person more clearly. So this isn't just a technical glitch, it has real-world consequences. People have been wrongfully arrested because of facial recognition systems or misidentified because of them. Others have been locked out of services or flagged as suspicious. Then the technology, when the technology is supposed to see us literally and can't see us accurately, it's not just bias, it's a form of digital erasure. When we consider museum databases and digital archives, the bias becomes particularly evident. Traditionally, major art collections have been dominated by white, Western male artists, creating skewed representation of art history and culture. Digital collections often build upon these existing biases, inherit these imbalances, reinforcing the visibility and perceived importance of certain voices over others. For instance, in 2019, there was a report from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that revealed only about 7% of their modern and contemporary collections featured women artists. Although museums have been making strides towards inclusivity, these embedded biases continue to shape perceptions of artistic significance and cultural value. Additionally, algorithmic bias contribute to creation of something called algorithmic bubbles or filter bubbles. Um, so these are basically where digital platforms present users primarily with the content that aligns with their previous interactions or perceived interests. So earlier when we were talking about what you're getting in your Instagram feeds and what do you think the algorithm thinks you like, all of that is based on your past interactions, whether that's search history, liking something, the amount of time you spend on a specific post. So it creates a feedback loop, reinforcing existing beliefs and biases rather than challenging or diversifying perspectives. Throughout today's talk, we've emphasized the importance of critical digital literacies, questioning the assumptions behind the systems that we use, and understanding how they shape our experiences. Recognizing and breaking out of these algorithmic bubbles is a vital part of this literacy. enabling us to access diverse viewpoints and foster a more inclusive digital culture. So this idea around a lack of diverse perspectives in um, museum spaces should sound pretty familiar to anyone who studied art history, myself included. The digital world is now creating its own canon, making its own decisions about what's visible and valuable. But instead of museum curators and art historians making these decisions, it's algorithms trained on data that often reflects the same historical biases. So historically, traditional art canons have systematically prioritized and legitimized certain types of art and artists while consistently marginalizing others. Dominated by Western white male perspective, the canon often sidelines forms of creativity um, or expression that are deemed like less serious or valuable, such as fiber arts, crafts, community-based practices, and art forms originating from non-Western traditions. These exclusions were not neutral or accidental, but they reinforced and reflected hierarchical ideas about race, gender, class, and culture. And here I often think back to my art history 101 textbook and the very specific viewpoints that it took. So in the digital age, similar processes of canon formation are occurring, this time mediated by algorithms rather than by humans. Algorithms are trained on historical data sets, inheriting these biases and perpetuating the same patterns of exclusion and marginalization. Digital platforms and databases thus risk amplifying traditional biases rather than disrupting them, reinforcing a narrow view of what's considered valuable or culturally significant. For instance, digital collections and platforms frequently prioritize content based on popularity, interaction metrics, and search optimization, which tend to favor already dominant cultural narratives and established creators. This reinforces the historical inequalities, shaping our collective understanding of cultural worth in a manner that mirrors past biases. So, to counteract this, we must consciously interrogate these digital frameworks. Institutions and platforms should adopt proactive measures such as curatorial transparency, diverse data training sets, and intentional outreach to diversify and democratize the digital canon. Recognizing historical parallels helps us understand the urgency of cultivating inclusive practices and underscores our responsibility to actively shape the digital landscape we inhabit. Oh, that's the wrong one. Did we miss one? Oh no, we're good. Sorry. So, when you picture success in your mind, what do you see? And I'm thinking of like a successful person, I suppose. So in your mind, what do you see when you look or think of a successful person? And I'll ask you to respond in the chat. Someone smiling. I love that. Leisure, power poses, older, serious, confident, certainly. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna look at something a little bit more lighthearted because that little they often show a person in a business, right? So when um so when you see this, I'm noticing the patterns in your response often being things like smiling and happy, and they don't necessarily align, right, with the image that we're seeing here. So often it's people in a business suit. I think somebody mentioned that, briefcase in hand, climbing stairs, or standing confidently. So what cultural values are being reinforced here? Who is left out of this narrative? How do these images shape our ideas of who can be successful and what success should look like? Okay, but it is not all doom and gloom, I promise. So, despite the significant challenges posed by algorithmic bias and the formation of exclusionary digital canons, there are artists, technologists, and activists who are pushing back and actively reshaping this landscape. One of the most important, in my opinion, is Joy Buolamwini, who I mentioned earlier, and she's the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. So her research through being at MIT and working with IBM has led to many other companies, such as Microsoft and Amazon, to pause and even reevaluate their facial recognition programs. She uses both data and art, such as her spoken word performance, AI, Ain't I a Woman, which is excellent. Highly recommend you YouTube that. She uses that to humanize the conversation around algorithmic fairness and to build a movement towards algorithmic justice. In her 2020 documentary Coded Bias, which is an incredibly powerful educational tool, but it really brought global attention to how unchecked AI systems reinforce systemic discrimination. Highly, highly recommend this film. Visual artist and geographer Trevor Paglen investigates the invisible power structures of surveillance, data collection, and machine learning. His project includes ImageNet Roulette in collaboration with AI researcher Kit Crawford, which exposes how AI training data sets reflect and perpetuate stereotypes. In machine vision, Hagelin photographs the types of images used to train AI systems, making visible what is usually hidden from public view. He also constructs large-scale photographic works and sculptures that interrogate the aesthetics of secrecy, exploring how state and corporate surveillance shape our understanding of the world. His art compels viewers to ask questions about who is watching, what is being collected, and what remains unseen. And last, just in this presentation, there are so many others. Stephanie Dinkins is a transdisciplinary artist and professor who centers the experiences of Black and Brown communities in the development of new technologies. Her project, Conversations with Bina 48, documents her long-term dialogue with one of the world's first Black social humanoid robots, exploring race, gender, and machine consciousness. In her work, Not the Only One, she trained a multi-generational AI chatbot on oral histories from her own family, creating a narrative-driven, culturally grounded form of artificial intelligence. It's a very cool project. Dinkins challenges dominant tech narratives by advocating for community-driven AI design and ethical data collection that practices prioritizing care, intimacy, and cultural specificity. So together, these creators are not just offering critique, but they're building alternatives. They demonstrate how critical digital literacy can be an act of resistance, care, and imagination. Their practices embody what it means to be seen, to see and be seen in the digital age, not through algorithmic accuracy alone, but through intentional human-centered design. By amplifying counter-narratives and advocating for just technologies, these individuals show us what's more equitable and represented in the representative digital culture might look like. Their work challenges us to consider not just what is possible with AI, but what is desirable, ethical, and just. All right, so how do we put all this into practice? We kind of learned about some of the problems that exist. Hopefully, you understand a little bit more about how, um, you know, digital literacy is important. But how do we put this into practice? So I want to give you a toolkit of 5 questions that you can ask of any digital tool, platform, or image that you encounter. And this is really not a checklist per se, but more about a habit of having questions, right? So the first is, who made this and why? This gets at intent, authority, and authorship. When you see a viral TikTok, who created it? When you see an AI generated image, who wrote the prompt? Can you tell if it's an AI generated image? Who built the system and who decided what data it was trained on? The second is what is it built on or trained on? So this reveals data sources and inherent assumptions. If you don't know who built it or what it was built on, why is it being kind of uh, obscured, perhaps? That AI generated art learned from somewhere, right? And so whose art did it learn from? The recommendation algorithms are suggesting content based on what kind of data that it's gathering about you. The third is how is it framed or presented? This is about design, interface, and hierarchy. Why does Instagram show us certain posts first? How does the layout of a museum's website influence what you notice? Even the choice of color and fonts carry meaning. 4, who benefits and who is harmed? This might be the most important question. And I would say in the massive, overwhelmed feeling of information overload can be the one that, while is most important, sometimes we forget to ask because we're constantly being inundated with information. Um, but when AI can generate art instantly, who wins and who loses? When algorithms amplify certain voices over others, what are the consequences? So looking for both inclusion and exclusion, as well as who's being celebrated and who may be being erased. The last one is what's missing or silenced. So often what's not there is just important as what is. So whose perspectives are absent, what stories aren't being told, what images aren't being created or shared. A tangential thing I often talk about around this particular piece of this framework is Wikipedia. So we all hopefully know and love how to use Wikipedia effectively and use the information that's created and shared on their site. To me, it is a beautiful notion of democratically sharing information and has always been part of their mission. Obviously, many of us know Wikipedia could be edited by anyone, and so there are some questions around authority there. But what's almost more important and interesting to me is that back in 2017, they did a study of English Wikipedia and revealed that the majority of the people who wrote and edited on Wikipedia were middle-aged white men. While this isn't inherently bad, it does mean that there are people, places, things, and ideas that are poorly represented or absent altogether, reflecting the lived experiences and interests of its authors. Thankfully, there are several organizations that do work to increase the voices of others in this space, such as the Black Lunch Table and Art and Feminism. I recommend you check out those as well. Those organizations are great. All right, so let's walk through an example together. I love this example. Let me see if I can fix this a little bit. Okay. Um, so this is called Trying to Take a Selfie in 1646. So thinking you can do this on your own. Think of a viral meme that you've seen recently, maybe something about success or current events. So I'm going to go through the 5 questions and kind of apply it to this. So who made this and why? So this meme was created by Classical Art Memes, a social media account that blends historical artwork with contemporary humor. Highly recommend checking this out. The motivation is obviously to entertain, engage, and make classical art more relatable to digital art audiences, especially by drawing parallels between old art practices and modern behaviors like selfies. Number 2, what is it built or trained on? The meme draws from classical self-portraiture painting attributed to a 17th century artist and overlays contemporary language, trying to take a selfie, juxtaposing historical content with modern digital culture. It relies on shared cultural knowledge of both classical painting and social media behavior to land the joke. How is it framed or presented? The humor comes from visual and textual contrast. The serious, redefined setting of 1600s portrait is humorously reframed through the modern lens of selfies. The presentation is meme style, square format, bold caption, simple layout, optimized for viral sharing and immediate recognition. Who benefits or who is harmed? It obviously benefits cultural institutions and educators by making classical art more accessible and humorous. It also boosts the visibility of classical artworks. There's a pretty minimal direct harm here, although you could probably argue that a meme like this simplifies or reduces nuanced historical art into surface level humor. What's missing or silenced? What's absence? What's absent in the original context of the painting? We don't know the artist's identity, the historical significance, the intended message of the work. It also omits broader conversations about portraiture, self-representation, or labor in the act of painting. In other words, it flattens the cultural and personal meaning behind the image in favor of a quick joke. But remember, this isn't just about finding the right answer, it's or becoming cynical about everything, which is why I tried to pick a kind of harmless example. It's mostly about staying curious and asking better questions to develop the habit of looking beneath the surface. So some takeaways. First, I want to just say like we're kind of gonna like synthesize these. And if anyone has more questions in depth at the end, we can certainly go over that. But first, digital systems reflect cultural values, not just data. So every algorithm, every platform, every AI system is shaped by human choices. What data to include, what goals to optimize for, what problems to solve. There's no such thing as neutral technology. The second is that AI isn't neutral. It mirrors its training, including all of our human biases. When we see AI reproducing stereotypes or excluding certain voices, it's not a bug. It's a feature of learning from biased data. This means we have a responsibility and an opportunity to shape the systems that we're learning. Third, museums and digital platforms are both forms of curation. So both make choices about what's visible and valuable, both influence how we understand art, history, and each other. And the skills we use to critically examine museum exhibitions are the ones we need to look for in our digital feeds. Critical digital literacy is fundamentally about agency. It's about your ability to make informed choices about the tools you use, the content you consume and create, and the digital world that you want to help build. Okay, so what can you do? And I want to be clear, this is not about becoming paranoid or rejecting technology, but every time you pause to ask who made this and why, you're practicing digital literacy. Every time you seek out art or voices that aren't already trending, you're shaping the algorithm. Um, every time you share these questions with others, you're expanding the circle of critical engagement. This work matters because information matters. It shapes how we see the world and how we see each other and how we imagine what's possible. In an age when machines are increasingly shaping that visual landscape, our human capacity for critical thinking, empathy, and justice becomes more important than ever. So here are some concrete ways to put this into practice. The first, apply the 5 critical questions that we talked about earlier. Make it a habit, any kind of content you create. 2, actively seek out voices that aren't being amplified. So following artists and creators from different backgrounds. Just yesterday, I saw a piece of art in a local coffee shop and they had the Instagram handle of the artist and I started following them. Share knowledge, discuss these concepts with friends, families, colleagues, students. Critical literacy grows through conversation. As someone who has worked in higher education, I have seen this firsthand that conversation is really where minds are changed. Create consciously. So if you create content, whether it's social media posts, exhibitions, or educational materials, consider who benefits and who might be excluded by your choices. And the last is to support organizations like Algorithmic Justice League or artists that are challenging and doing advocacy around transparency in AI systems. So I have a list of resources here. I wanted to give a really quick shout out to the first four. Shameless plug for the first one, the DLF Digital Library Pedagogy Toolkit is one that I helped to co-edit with some colleagues at UCLA. This is going to include like open access lesson plans, concepts, frameworks, mostly around teaching, but they're all really interesting. Highly recommend. Algorithms of oppression, we didn't get into a lot today, but Sophia Noble, I've seen speak, and I consider this a pretty foundational text around algorithms and how they reinforce systematic racism. Joy Buolamwini, who we've already spoken about. Um, this is her most recent book. And then Kathy O'Neill also wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And that talks more a little bit about data holistically and how it impacts our daily lives through things like applying for mortgages or surveillance, which some of the artists I mentioned earlier also talk about. But there's quite a few here. I will not get into all of them, but they're in the presentation that will be shared later. So I think I just wanted to say in closing that I really wanted to hear from all of you what your one question is that you're going to carry forward the next time you engage with an image, artwork, or algorithm. So this can be either a really big question or a more specific question that's come up as you've kind of been listening throughout. Yeah, is it AI? It's a really good question. I think it's a question we're going to have to ask ourselves more and more and more. How does this impact individuals versus the public? Absolutely. Do I like it? An always important question, certainly. Yes, the idea of originality, as I said, I think is a whole other talk, but I think especially important when we're thinking about digital literacies. Okay, so with that, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your questions. And these are exactly what digital literacy looks like in practice, critical digital literacy. You're already thinking like critics, advocates, and conscious participants in our digital culture. Thank you so much for being curious and engaged and being committed to learning more. And outside of that, I'm ready for questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. We'll segue into the Q&A portion of today's session. Um, I haven't seen some questions about this in the chat, but I do just want to mention that if you didn't request a copy of the slides when you were registering for this program, feel free to just message us at library@frick.org, and we're happy to supply you with those slides. Those resources are really great at the end, Mackenzie, so thanks so much for including that. So I'm going to start with the Q&A. So our first question is, how do you see the environmental impact of the technology as well as the human impact on people employed to label training data, often for low pay and creates the same trauma as internet moderation, as fitting into the key issues of AI?
Yeah, this is definitely an important question or holistically around AI. And I want to say I was a part of another panel on AI, and another panelist said this, and I thought it was so smart. There are no AI experts, so anyone that tells you otherwise is lying. That being said, this is not I'm not an AI expert in terms of knowing every aspect of how it works. But as librarians, I think we're all interested in the impact of this technology. The environmental impact is significant. However, I do think that the ways in which it is impacting us are sometimes skewed in terms of the way it's being message. So I know what was going around a while ago was this idea of like for every prompt you ask, every 300 word prompt, you're using one bottle of water. And I think that's a valuable analogy, and that it makes people pay attention to the ways that they're using this technology and the environmental impact. However, much like other forms of the ways in which global warming is, it's really about these bigger industries and large companies that are um, housing these like big data warehouses. That being said, and I think similarly, the impact in terms of, oftentimes when working with students, they're very concerned about jobs and taking away their jobs. I think that personally, I think that there's no putting this technology back in a box. And so at this point, I think it's super important to be aware, but also this idea that we don't have to, in the words of Silicon Valley, like rush ahead and break things. I think if there was an intentional slowing down and real thoughtful conversation as a culture around what we want to value and how we want to use this technology to better our everyday lives, as opposed to allowing it to take over and seeing what it can do. That would be my personal dream, right? That's what I'm vision boarding. Whether or not that will happen, I think is trickier. And I think until there's some real collective governance certainly around it as well. We are kind of just watching it happen in front of us. But yes, the environmental impact is super important. I think the economic impact also very important, and something that, you know, we're going to have to grapple with as a culture moving forward.
Our next question is, I'm studying digital stewardship right now, including the importance of preserving born digital materials as part of our cultural heritage. If we don't preserve and make these works accessible, isn't the historical record of cultural heritage incomplete?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say it is incomplete. I also think that there are things about preservation and this idea that our culture is so digital now and there are so many digitally created objects that we have to be really thoughtful about preservation, certainly, but also the ways in which we are preserving these things that are not only living in their own bubble, I guess. So we're lucky in that most historical material that we either have, like obviously we have the physicalness of it, but I think also there's typically some kind of a digital record. So I think in terms of digitally born objects, certainly it's important to have a record of those. And I think just being intentional about the ways in which we are preserving them and thinking about, technology that 10 years ago or that now, from 10 years ago that is almost obsolete, and how we kind of like ethically think through preserving that material as well. So yeah, I think it's absolutely important that we continue to preserve that, even if it is, born digital, because this is the place that our culture is in right now, certainly.
Our next question is, would these biases be different in another country slash culture?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would say yes. Um, I think that the biases reflect, I mean, it's an interesting question in that the US is in many ways a melting pot of other cultures. But I do think that in this particular moment and the ways in which we are using technology, um, that it is a very direct result of the way our culture has promoted or created biases. So, like, immediately I'm thinking of like beauty standards, right? And like the biases we hold against that being really different, or, even things such as, there are some countries in which the idea of copying is not considered stealing, right? But in fact, it's a form of like honoring and giving tribute to. And so there's a real difference in the cultural ways that we think about ownership, specifically in the US. And I think copyright is like a very uniquely, like ownership of ideas and IP can be something that is pretty Western. And I think that that is probably really different in other cultures as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. I want to be respectful of your time. I also want to thank Luann, our ASL interpreter, and Marie, who provided our live captioning for today, as well as my colleagues across the Frick Collection who made this program possible. Again, I'm so grateful that you were able to join us today and deliver this wonderful presentation for our community, Mackenzie. I'm going to let you have the last word.
Oh,
So
that's
take
so
it away.
kind. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. It's been such a treat to think through this specifically in terms of the audience that you have at the Frick. And I think the last thing is to just for everyone is to keep questioning, keep learning, and to like ultimately not let this be kind of like a negative thing, but this idea of like we really want to try to speculate better alternative futures. And so even though generative AI and critical digital literacy can feel overwhelming and kind of doom and gloomy. I think there are a lot of ways that it will allow us to rethink positive futures. So I would say try to stay positive, and yeah, just stay curious.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Take
Thank
care.
you all.
Bye.
Bye.